So now, let's get started. Last week, when President Donald Trump described the two mass shootings as a, quote, mental health problem, your CEO, Dr. Arthur Evans, immediately responded by issuing a statement reminding the public that that information was all wrong. In a move that took courage, Dr. Evans boldly called it unfounded to blame the shootings on mental health, and especially without considering bigotry, hateful rhetoric, and access to guns. Dr. Evans is a scientist practitioner, a clinical and community psychologist, and healthcare innovator. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage, Dr. Arthur Evans. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So as we start this conversation, the first question that I had for you is the APA has approached the conversation about gun violence at least every year for the past 5 years. Why was it important for you to have this conversation specifically in Chicago and on this broad of a stage?
Well, we've taken a very strong stand on this issue because when you look at the public policy around gun violence, it doesn't match what we know from the science. And as a scientific organization, we think it's really important to inform public policy, to make sure that we're using the knowledge that we have as a discipline and profession to really address these big social issues. The reason that we thought that it was important to address this in Chicago is that for over a decade, I was a commissioner of behavioral health in the city of Philadelphia. In every major city in this country, we are dealing with gun violence on a day-to-day basis. And it seems like the national conversation around gun violence only occurs when there is a mass shooting. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important for us to make sure that our public, our policymakers understand that this is a much bigger issue and that we have to think about not only these mass shootings, but what's happening in this country on a day-to-day basis. Many more people, unfortunately, die from gunshots during the week than these major incidents.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you used the phrase day to day. You've explained the stance as an organization of trying to influence public policy and having a role in that national conversation. But what can psychologists do day to day in their own work to have an impact in this field?
That is a great question. And I think that the thing that we can bring as people who are trained first as scientists, even if you're a practitioner, you're trained as a scientist and then as a practitioner, I think it's important for us to know what the science says, to know what the research says, and to be able to educate. In almost all these instances, whether you're in Iowa or Chicago or Philadelphia, media and people in the media are putting out information that we know is incorrect. And I think as psychologists, we should be able to write to editors. We should make sure that we are available to the media. It's really important for our voice as a discipline and profession to be out there on these issues.
Mm-hmm. You talk about being out there and talking to the media. You've done that quite a bit this week as you have corrected President Trump, who wrongly asserted that the mass shootings were a result of mental illness. Can you talk about the role that hateful rhetoric plays and bigotry in these types of incidents?
It's a very good question. I think in our statement, we said that blaming mass shootings on mental illness is simplistic and it's inaccurate and it doesn't follow the data. It is simplistic because if you look at whether it's mass shootings or gun violence in general, there are a confluence of issues that are influencing that phenomena. And we thought it was really important to get that broader picture out there. And so we're going to continue to do that. It's important that we do that as an association.
Mm-hmm. In Chicago, which is where you're hosting this wonderful event, our mayor, Lori Lightfoot, has said that gun violence should be handled as a public health crisis. Can you give me some feedback on what that looks like? Can you unpack how that approach would look?
Couldn't agree more. This is a public health issue. And if you think about the public health issues that we've had in this country, whether it's smoking or using seatbelts, things, if you go back 20, 40 years, you look at these kinds of issues where I guess the public believed that this was a problem that we couldn't solve. And when we've used public health approaches, we've actually been able to solve those. In the gun issue, I think one of the things that public health teaches us is that we ought to be working as far upstream on these issues as possible. We should be looking at not only how do we deal with people who are at that point at which they are about to commit one of these acts, and we certainly should be doing that, but we should be thinking about much further upstream, not only for that individual, but also in terms of developmentally, what are the things that we do to help children develop in a way that they don't see violence as a way of solving problems and addressing issues. And so that public health mindset, that way of thinking about issues, I think opens up a whole range of things that we should be doing that if we're only thinking about the crisis, we miss.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So often when we talk about gun violence, one of the things that gets tossed around a lot is the word senseless. You challenge that word. Talk to me about why.
What I think is senseless about gun violence is that we're not doing anything about it. The fact that we know things that we could do to reduce gun violence in this country and we don't do it, to me, that is senseless. The other reason that we ought to challenge that word is that when you talk about these issues as being senseless, what it does is it creates an image in people's mind that this is an intractable problem, that these people are doing something that we have no answers for, we have no explanations for. And the fact is, we do have an explanation for much of that. And you're going to hear from experts today that have studied this and can talk to us about what the research says around that. We need to understand that this is not an intractable problem. It is not. We know some things that can help reduce gun violence, and we need to do the research to develop new interventions. If we have a plane crash in this country, within hours, we are deploying people to that plane crash to try to understand every single thing that we can so that it doesn't happen again. We will spend millions of dollars just to find the black box because we don't want that to happen again. We need to do the exact same thing when there's a mass shooting in this country, and we can. So I would love to see us develop the research, develop the political will to respond to these situations in a very similar way. We can do that, and I think it starts with committed people like us standing up, having a voice. And I will say this, you mentioned the coverage that APA got. Within 72 hours, we were cited in over 1,000 publications and articles around the world, literally around the world. Our voice was out there, and what that told us is that when we act boldly, when we are unapologetic about putting the research out there, when we are truthful, that people listen. I had a colleague to even send me a note about a Fox News show where conservative commentators were talking about APA and the research that we cited. And so even across the political spectrum, we can have an impact when we do that. And I think that as an association, I think it's an exciting time because I think we see more and more of our members stepping up and stepping into that void.
Absolutely. No, you've been very visible and, as you said, unapologetic in tackling this issue. It's very admirable. There's so many things that we could talk about. We could talk about trauma. We could talk about public policy. But as we enter into this broader conversation and bring out some of the other guests, what are your hopes and wishes for this audience? What do you want them to take away from this conversation that we're having?
Well, I hope that every single person in this audience commits themselves to this issue. I think that, again, it's senseless that we're not doing something as a country on an issue that we know that there are things that we can do. And I hope that People will educate themselves, be willing to write a brief letter, to talk to their legislators about things that they can do. This is something that we can actually change, and I hope we're starting a movement in this country or joining a movement, because there are many people that have been talking about this for years, and I think joining our voice to that chorus, I think will make a big difference. So I hope people will do that.
And so you want your members to then be moved to action from today?
The time for waiting is over.
Indeed, agreed. Thank you so much for this conversation.